That doesn't sound like democracy. Here's the White House press secretary taking some time off from her junior year at Oberlin to speak to her fellow undergrads at something called Pod Save America about how rising crime rates are actually an invention of those racists at Fox News.
Right now, just to give you a sense, so CNN, Pentagon, as many as 8,500 U.S. troops on heightened alert. Okay, true. Same on MSNBC. CNBC is doing their own thing about the market. And then on Fox is Jeanine Pirro talking about soft on crime consequences. I mean, what does that even mean, right? So there's an alternate universe on some coverage. What's scary about it is a lot of people watch that and they think that the president isn't doing anything to address people's safety.
Yeah, so what do your kids getting shot have to do with Ukraine? Nothing, Dumbo. You're living in an alternate universe. That's Jen Psaki's position. You'd have to be delusional to think crime was a problem in this country, unless you happened to be in Georgetown last night around 6:45 p.m. If you were there, you may have seen a man shot to death outside Georgetown Cupcakes. That's just off M Street. And the funny thing is, that's not too far from where Jen Psaki lives. But did Jen Psaki acknowledge that happened? Of course she didn't. Noticing the collapse of your civilization is racist, even when it's happening just down the street. Look away, Jen Psaki, look away! And whatever you do, don't go to Baltimore. Baltimore is a major American city. It's only about 40 miles from where Jen Psaki lives. It's one of the worst places in the Western Hemisphere. It's a little bit of Haiti in the mid-Atlantic. Baltimore is exactly what happens when you apply Jen Psaki's ideas to governing. Baltimore is a city run by people who fervently believe in the equity agenda and consider gender studies a legitimate academic discipline. In Baltimore, pretty much everyone in charge is black, yet it's a matter of religious faith that the main thing holding the city back is white racism. In other words, everybody with power in Baltimore agrees with Jen Psaki. So it's an entirely fair question to ask, hey, Jen Psaki, what do you think of Baltimore? How did the city get that way? You claim to care so deeply about African Americans, you never stop talking about that. And yet here is one of the biggest black majority cities in the United States. Tens of thousands of black people who live in Baltimore are in misery because their kids keep getting murdered. Last year, Baltimore's murder rate was higher than it is in El Salvador and Honduras. Now, those are countries the State Department tells us to, quote, avoid due to crime. So it's fair to say things are incredibly violent in Baltimore. They have been for a long time. And yet, under Joe Biden, somehow, they've gotten even worse in Baltimore. Here's a local news report from today.
The hugging and crying of a loved one.
36 murders in 31 days. That's the deadliest January in Baltimore in nearly 50 years. And remember, 50 years ago, Baltimore was almost twice as big as it is now. Half the city's left. So Baltimore is far worse off than it has ever been in its history. And it's not just murders. Drug crimes are up dramatically. You might not know that because they're not being prosecuted anymore. Last spring, the local city attorney, a George Soros puppet called Marilyn Mosby, announced she would no longer prosecute low-level drug crimes. So arrests plummeted. But drug trafficking exploded. Here's what it looks like.
Our cameras caught what appears to be one of those open-air drug deals happening in broad daylight near the Edmondson Village Shopping Center. It's an issue we've been hearing about in neighborhoods citywide throughout the summer. It comes after City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby stopped prosecuting certain drug crimes in the city, including drug possession. A major policy shift that some believe have left the issue to only flourish.
Jen Psaki's for that. Black people don't want laws to be enforced. That's her view. That's the view of everyone she knows. But what did policies like that do to Baltimore? Well, they turned a once beautiful city into a slum. According to a report by Fox 45 in Baltimore, public school administrators have instructed the police to stop arresting students for committing crimes. And that would include serious offenses from burglary to assault. So the cops did stop arresting kids. The number of students arrested in Baltimore schools has dropped by 98% in the last decade. That looks good on paper, but it turns out ignoring crime is not the same as stopping crime. Schools in Baltimore got so bad that kids stopped learning anything. Watch this report and ask yourself, what is Baltimore going to look like in 20 years?
In reading, 628 Patterson High School students took the test. 484 of them, or 77%, tested at an elementary school reading level. That includes 71 high school students who are reading at a kindergarten level and 88 students reading at a first grade level. Another 45 are reading at a second grade level. Just 12 students tested at Patterson High School were reading at grade level. That comes out to less than 2%.
So the kids can't read. They're illiterate. What does their future look like? What does Baltimore's future look like? What does the country's future look like? How are they going to participate in our society? You wouldn't know any of this was happening by looking at the official graduation numbers, because last year Baltimore announced that students will graduate from high school even if they fail their courses. Baltimore's so-called chief academic officer, that would be a Harvard-educated bureaucrat called Joan Dabrowski, announced that this policy was designed to, quote, avoid the punitive approach of failing students. Okay, but somebody is failing students in Baltimore. Somebody, in fact, is failing the entire city. And you have to ask yourself, who would that be? You'd like to ask Jen Psaki, who do you blame for Baltimore? Did white men do this to Baltimore? Was it the patriarchy? Was it structural racism that caused all those murders? Do you agree with Pete Buttigieg that Klansmen urban planners put the highways in the wrong place? And that's the real problem, racist roads. Or could it be that the real problem with Baltimore is something much more obvious? Could it be that progressive policies designed to, quote, lift up marginalized communities, in the end, destroyed those communities? What's the answer, Jen Psaki? In a functioning democracy, people like Jen Psaki would have to tell us the answer. They would be required to live in Baltimore until they learned something, just as the people who wrecked Afghanistan probably ought to explain what they've learned before they move on to Ukraine and Russia. That ought to be a requirement. And in fact, honestly, you'd think that people like this would welcome a chance to reflect on what they've done. They have screwed up very badly. They've hurt the weakest among us. For Christians, that's the greatest sin. But these people aren't Christians. They worship only themselves, so they turn away. You can bet money that Jen Psaki rarely goes to Baltimore. It's just too depressing, and it raises too many questions. Instead, Jen Psaki and her friends are planning their fun little summer trips to Bozeman, or Martha's Vineyard, or East Hampton, or some other remote and blindingly white outpost of privilege. Funny how that works. You wreck stuff, and then you ignore it. This allows you to wreck more stuff without feeling guilty. That's modern progressivism distilled to 18 words. Candace Owens is the host of Candace. We're always honored to have her on this show.